Welcome, everyone. My name is Patrick Butler, and I am the Vice President of Content and Community at ICFJ, the International Center for Journalists. And I welcome you to IJNet, an urgent crisis for journalists in Afghanistan. This program, IJNet, is a project of ICFJ that provides expert advice, tools, and opportunities for journalists around the world in 8 languages. We encourage you to visit ijnet.org and sign up for our weekly bulletin in the language of your choice. Today, we're going to be talking to Censorship Mahdi, who was the 2012 winner of ICFJ's Knight International Journalism Award, given to him for his outstanding work in transforming Afghan television news. Until very recently, Sami was the Afghanistan bureau chief for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Before that, he was the strategic advisor to Tolo News, the director of Afghanistan's PAIC Investigative Journalism Center, the CEO of Khurshid TV, and the director of news and current affairs at One TV. He has a master's degree in international relations from the University of Massachusetts, and he was, until very recently, a lecturer in journalism at the University of Kabul. Sami was able to leave Afghanistan just hours before the Taliban took control of Kabul. Sami, all of us at ICFJ are relieved that you are out of Afghanistan, but of course, like you, we are very concerned about all the journalists who remain in Afghanistan and face very grave threats from the Taliban. We're going to talk about that today, as well as about how all of us can help Afghan journalists. If you have questions for Sami, you can post them in the Q&A here on Zoom at the bottom of the screen, and we will get to them in the second half of our talk. If you're watching us on Facebook, you can also post questions there, and my colleagues will get them to me. And finally, you can join the conversation on Twitter with the hashtag ICFJLive. All right, let's get started. Welcome, Sami, first of all. We're very grateful to you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for that introduction, and I'm delighted to be here talking to your audiences and your friends on ICFJ.
Great. Sami, I know you were in touch with many journalists who are still in Afghanistan. What are they telling you?
Well, they are telling me that the space for free press and freedom of expression is shrinking, unfortunately. They are receiving threats. Some of the journalists have been beaten up by the Taliban soldiers across the country, especially in Kabul. We have also reports of members of families of some journalists being killed by the Taliban. And there is an atmosphere of fear and terror, unfortunately, after experiencing 2 decades of freedom of expression in the country and becoming the most vibrant environment in the region for a free press and media.
Yeah, and talk a little bit more about what you're hearing regarding the threats and the violence that has already been committed against some journalists. What's the worst of what you're hearing?
Well, as I said, they have been going and searching for some journalists that they feel they have posed some kind of threat against the Taliban and their kind of mentality and ideology. They have started searching people door to door, and some female journalists, especially on working for the national state TV, have been asked by the Taliban to not come to their work anymore. And what I'm hearing is everyone is trying to escape from the country. That's the kind of fear is out there in the atmosphere. I mean, people who had the chance and opportunities time and again to go to the United States or any other safe Western countries and live there, and they always refuse to leave their country and their job and the service they have been delivering for the country. Now they are preparing to leave and escape the country. That's the kind of stories I'm hearing.
Okay. Many organizations, including ICFJ, have signed a statement asking the G7, the group of seven, to do all it can to protect and evacuate journalists and media workers. But the window is closing. US troops will likely leave by the August 31st deadline in less than a week. And many journalists at risk can't even get to the airport or are being turned away once they're there. What do you fear for those who are going to be left behind?
Well, one of my colleagues, former colleagues, told me that as he was trying to get into the Kabul airport, he was beaten up by the Taliban soldiers and his arm was broken. And he had to spend more than 24 hours inside the Kabul airport without receiving any kind of medical support with the broken arm. That kind of stories we hear from journalists and media workers in Afghanistan. And to be honest, I think the deadline for 31st August is unrealistic. Just like many other deadlines and agreements that the United States made with the Taliban, a group which never honored its promises and their, mentioned in the agreements between the United States and the Taliban. But this deadline is very unrealistic. Thousands and thousands of people are still waiting behind the gates of Kabul airport. That's one thing. The second thing is, I still think that G7 in the United States and other countries, and also international NGOs who are working for humanitarian support and also for freedom of expression, for human rights, and so on, still have a leverage, still can help Afghanistan, still can push the Taliban to show some concessions and respect human rights, respect women's rights, respect freedom of expression. The Taliban are still looking for international recognition, which we could talk about, elaborate about it, in few minutes. But that is still a kind of leverage that the international community has got and can push Taliban to show more concessions for these basic rights. Otherwise, Taliban will, reinstall the kind of regime that Afghanistan has experienced under the Taliban in 1990s.
Right. There's two kinds of journalists that we often talk about in Afghanistan: those who worked for Western media outlets and those who work for Afghan media outlets. How are their situations different? What are the different kinds of risks that each one faces if they're left behind?
I think both are facing threats and danger equally, because both have been working for freedom of expression and giving a platform to the most vulnerable sectors of the society. I have worked for domestic media as well as for international media. I don't see any difference in the kind of threats, but I see a difference in the kind of privileges. Okay. Those journalists who have worked for international media are more well connected, have more opportunities to leave the country, or even being safe, even if they stay longer inside the country, because of their connections with the international community and because of the sensitivity of the matter that Taliban understand very well. But the domestic media journalists and workers, they are under more pressure because they do not have such kind of privileges. But I don't mean that international media journalists are not under pressure. They are also, but they have more chance.
Okay. You've even before the Taliban took over, you lived through some very horrible experiences, including a colleague of yours being killed in Helmand province. Do you think that will start to happen more?
Well, unfortunately, during this 15 years that I have been a journalist in Afghanistan, I have lost so many colleagues in different. I have colleagues. I have lost colleagues in One TV. I have lost colleagues in Tolo TV, and I have lost colleagues in Radio Azadi, which is the Afghan branch of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. So that's a horrible, horrible experience to have. You know, your good friends, your very close colleagues, being killed by a terrorist group. This is something that will keep you wake up during the nights. This ongoing nightmare. And I have been personally under threat for months. Unfortunately, I had to live and remain inside our bureau in Kabul 24/7 for about 2 months because our security department thought that it's too dangerous for me to go outside. But my case is not unique, unfortunately. So many other reporters, media editors have experienced similar risks to their lives in Afghanistan, unfortunately, in Kabul and provinces. But I salute to their, courage that they have still continued to work under unbelievable circumstances, and some of them are still in Kabul, working and being standing their grounds and standing tall against the Taliban and against any other group who are trying to limit the freedom of expression.
Yes, every independent journalist has shown tremendous courage over the years, but those working now are showing much more, and we all salute them. We talked a little bit about the special problems of women journalists. You mentioned that some of them have been barred from appearing on air. I read just yesterday that the Taliban is telling women they should stay home because their fighters have not yet been trained not to hurt women, which is horrific in and of itself. What are your fears for women journalists in particular?
Well, Taliban have a history of, being misogynists and being against women's rights and suppressing any freedom and any social space for women. We remember 1990s, and we know what was happening in the areas controlled by the Taliban in the past 2 decades. So the same kind of draconian laws and orders will come back to Afghanistan, and women will suffer the most. You know that I teach at Kabul University, and I really wish, this is my dream, to get back to school and see my students once again. One of my colleagues the other day told me that the Taliban have ordered all universities in the western province of to separate between girls and boys in the school. I mean, to segregate students based on gender. Professors were saying that we do not have enough teachers and instructors for women. The Taliban have told them that if you do not have enough female instructors, then only old men can teach at the classes for girls. I mean,
only
that kind
old
of
men?
Yes, old men. Old men. Yeah.
And of course, women teachers would not be allowed to teach male students.
Of course not. Of course not. So that kind of segregation and that kind of rules definitely limits the space for girls. And unfortunately, one can foresee that we are going to have another generation of young girls, who will not have the opportunity, the right to go to school and study and then work. outside their homes.
Now, on this subject, the Taliban is really trying to present a new public relations face to the world, saying that they will respect women's rights, that they will respect freedom of expression. Can we believe that, or is it going to be the same as it was in the 90s?
You know, as someone who follows the international media and also domestic media, this is surprising, the level of acceptance of this message in the international media.
Really?
And by contrast, you see no signs of acceptance in the domestic media and by people, ordinary people in Afghanistan. No one buys that message in Afghanistan. Everyone knows the kind of mentality and the kind of ideology Taliban has got. And they have practiced this ideology for decades now. They are well known. And we hear that people are talking about moderate Taliban and, you know, new Taliban versus old Taliban, but we don't see the difference, much difference between the old Taliban and the new Taliban. They are the same Taliban. They say Islam is the same, we are the same, we have the same leaders. So yeah, there is one change in Taliban. They are more familiar with technology now. They know how to spread their PR and their messages across international media, but the content of the message is the same. At the same time, one should also regard that and mention that there is a difference between those Taliban, difference of opinion and PR and messaging between Taliban who are residing in Qatar and who were engaged in negotiations with the United States of America and those Taliban who, I mean, ordinary soldiers and fighters who have been fighting in Afghanistan for 2 decades now. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't look like the Qatari Taliban have much influence on the Taliban on the ground. So this difference also is problematic for the future. And now I'm not sure if the Qatari Taliban are good counterparts for international community to negotiate with.
That's a very important point. And I think we're also seeing differences in the way Taliban is behaving in Kabul versus in the provinces, where they're probably less observed or there's not as many people watching.
Yeah, I think, sorry for cutting you,
no,
but I think it's all because they want international recognition. Yeah. And for international recognition, many of my colleagues have told me that there is a sense, there is a feeling in Afghanistan, especially in Kabul, that once they get the international recognition, their behavior will change drastically. And that is something they didn't get in 1990s. Only 3 countries, Pakistan, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, recognized them as legitimate government of Afghanistan. The rest of the world didn't recognize them. So now they think they will get this recognition, and after this recognition, they will, bring back and impose the way they see Islamic laws and their interpretation of Islam.
And so it stands to follow then that you would not like to see that recognition happen because we would be giving up any leverage that we have.
Yes, I think the international community has this leverage because any future Taliban government will be economically dependent on foreign aid and humanitarian assistance. So if that leverage is given to the Taliban easily, we will have a humanitarian catastrophe and drastic setbacks in terms of women's rights, human rights, freedom of expression, and minorities' rights. I think that's the last leverage that international community has got and shouldn't be given in very easily.
Yeah. I want to remind everyone that you can post your questions in the chat or on Facebook and join the discussion on Twitter with the hashtag ICFJ Live. I did want to say that for security reasons, Sami prefers not to talk about where he is now or how he got out of Afghanistan. So we won't be able to answer those kinds of questions, but there's still a lot of questions to come from me and from you all, I'm sure. So let me ask a few more before we turn to the question from the audience. Sami, what do you think the media in Afghanistan will look like in 6 months? Will there be any independent outlets left, or will all media be mouthpieces for the Taliban?
From what I hear and what my friends have been telling me in the past 2 weeks now, since the Taliban took over Kabul, independent media editors, reporters, and investors are trying to get out of the country. Mm-hmm. That means that in a few months, we will have only the state-run, the Taliban-run media in Afghanistan. Others should either accept whatever Taliban is saying to become their mouthpiece, or just leave the country and quit. Mm-hmm. You know, I did research on the future of media in Afghanistan if Taliban take over or if we have a political settlement with the Taliban. And some of the interviewees, who, I mean, all of them have been journalists or media executives, told me that it's better to be silent than to tell lie. Mm. So it's better to quit news media than have news media and just, you know, keep telling lies. Mm-hmm. And that kind of fear is there, and that kind of risk is still there. Every day I hear a new media personality has evacuated from the country. I mean, our best journalists have been evacuating. They are leaving their loved country. And as I mentioned earlier, I know these people personally. They are my friends. They are like sisters and brothers and very, very close friends to me. They were never ready to leave. I'm one of them. Mm-hmm. I can say that I had this opportunity time and again. They had this opportunity, but we never thought that one day we will leave our country. And we thought, I still think that we were meant to serve our nation, and a nation that has lost so much and has experienced so much darkness. So we are the ones who could try to, you know, bring some light and some hope in the lives of these people. But unfortunately, I see that these dreams are collapsing, and unfortunately this is happening. But international community still has some chance, and we are hopeful. We are hoping that international community will push the Taliban to you know, create a broad-based government and create you know, respect some space for freedom of expression and other fundamental rights.
Yeah. You said something interesting a while ago, which is that Afghanistan before the takeover had one of the freest media in the region. And I think a lot of people may not be aware of that. Can you tell us a little bit about how you saw journalism changing in the 15 years or so that you've been a journalist in Afghanistan?
Well, I'm, you know, from the first generation of free media journalists in Afghanistan. So the experience is as young as my experience in the country and in the field of journalism and free media. 20 years ago, we had only one radio station, the Radio Sharia, run by the Taliban, and we had no newspapers, we had no radios, we had no TV stations in the areas controlled by the Taliban. Now we have got about 100 TV stations, hundreds of radios and publications, and also social media, and I mean millions of social media users across Afghanistan, and they are really competing with mainstream media in breaking news and information. This thing doesn't exist in any of our neighboring countries. I mean, to the west we have got Iran,
Right.
only state-run or very limited freedom of expression there. The north we have got former Soviet Union republics, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, who have no free media. To the south and east, we have got Pakistan, and everybody knows that Pakistani media, unfortunately, is under so much pressure by the government, especially the army. And to the northeast, we have got China. So Afghanistan is a beacon of freedom of expression in the region, and we have always said that that we can, share our experience with freedom of expression with the region, and have done so. So we see a revolution of freedom of expression and media in Afghanistan in the past 20 years. Media has been part of democracy and the movement for democratic governance and women's rights, human rights, and minorities' rights. We didn't have in the past 2 years any kind of well-established political opposition to the government. So media was kind of playing that kind of role as well. I know the term advocacy journalism sometimes or most of the time is not very popular in the West, but Afghan journalists had to do some advocacy for basic rights as well all the time, because there was no other force to stand for these values. And even now, if you see, the state has collapsed. The national army and police has collapsed. We don't have the parliament anymore, but the media is still standing tall, and is still, ready to sacrifice.
When you talk about sort of the media advocating for important things in Afghan society, such as women's rights, I'm sure it reminds me of one of the reasons you won our Knight International Journalism Award was for really revolutionary programming that you did at One TV, including, among others, a show called The Mask. And I want you to just tell people a little bit about that show, because it really was groundbreaking.
Thank you, Patrick, for remembering that. It was a platform for those women who were facing and experiencing domestic violence in Afghanistan. As you know, the rights of women and the violence that unfortunately they face within their own houses is kind of very difficult to talk about in cultures like ours. Unfortunately, it's kind of taboo. But we provided, not only myself, but a great team was working on that program. We provided a platform. We were masking the face of those women who were victims of domestic violence, and they would come and just talk about their experience. And the purpose of the show was to shake the conscience of society and tell people what you're doing with your sisters, with your daughters, with your wives, and I mean, these human beings, and why you're doing this. And we have to change this once and forever. That show became very popular in a very, very short period of time. And I don't see that we will be able to run similar concepts on Afghan media in the future. Because if a regime runs the country which believes in violence against women and suppressing women, then there will be no space for such kind of ideas and concepts.
Yeah, and it's just heartbreaking to think of women now being once again forced to remain in their homes, and that will, I'm sure, only increase the domestic abuse that you were fighting against. We've talked a lot about women's rights in Afghanistan. One that I don't see a lot of attention to is the persecution that will undoubtedly get worse against communities like the Hazara minority. What do you anticipate for minorities like the Hazaras?
Unfortunately, Hazara minority in Afghanistan, that they are also, I mean, most of them are Shias as well, Muslim Shias. They have been under pressure, and there has been a systematic discrimination and historic discrimination against Hazaras in Afghanistan, unfortunately. And they have been particularly victims of violence by the Taliban and by Daesh or ISIS in Afghanistan. Their worship places, schools, neighborhoods, I mean, gymnasiums, everywhere belonging to their communities and their neighborhoods have been under attack, unfortunately. They have been under attack because of their ethnicity and because of their religious beliefs, unfortunately. And we have evidence of Taliban leaders in the past who have spoken openly against Hazaras, and who have said openly that they will kill Hazaras, or they'll just do some kind of ethnic cleansing against them. So I'm really worried about these parts of the society. They had an opportunity in the past 20 years to have at least their say and to use the freedom of expression environment in the country. And I think we are going to lose that. Taliban committed the worst atrocities against Hazaras in 1990s. According to the Human Rights Watch, in 1998, they killed thousands of Hazara boys and men in Mazar-e Sharif only, in northern province of Balkh, and also in Bamiyan. So it's their future is very worrisome.
Yeah. Just a couple of quick questions, and then I'm going to start looking at the questions from our audience. What recommendations do you have for people who are listening who want to help Afghan journalists? We published on IJNet recently a guide to what different international organizations like the Committee to Protect Journalists, among many others, are doing to help Afghan journalists. And I asked my colleague to please post that link in the chat so that anybody can click on that and see that story, because it does give you some really good advice on how you can help and how Afghan journalists trying to get out, what efforts they might be able to use. What do you recommend for anyone listening who wants to help Afghan journalists?
Well, first of all, spread the word that we have this vibrant media environment, and this is under attack and under pressure. We should keep it going, and we should keep this environment alive. That's the first. Second, continue working with the Afghan media. I mean, international NGOs shouldn't give up. They should continue working with Afghan media inside Afghanistan and outside Afghanistan. If the space is shrinking inside Afghanistan, I think, given the fact that there is still access to internet and international media, international NGOs could support Afghan media to continue working even from abroad. Similar to what we have, many media outlets are working for Iran from abroad, right? We could continue doing that. And the third thing is, I think is that those Afghan journalists whose lives are under the risk and at risk, international NGOs should help them to get out of the country and go somewhere safe and continue working there. And the last thing, which is very, very important from my point of view, is that you should pressure your own governments, your own capitals, to push the Taliban and do not recognize the Taliban until they guarantee freedom of expression and women's rights and human rights in Afghanistan. I think these are very, very important, fundamental, easy but fundamental things to do.
Okay, you talked a lot about making sure that Western governments use their leverage and do not recognize the Taliban government before getting those assurances. What about aid? Should that? There's always this problem of if you cut off the aid, there will be a lot of suffering. But if you continue the aid, it can embolden the Taliban government. What do you recommend there?
I recommend that humanitarian aid shouldn't be cut, because people will suffer from that if it's cut. But I think the money and the resources shouldn't be given to the Taliban. Mm-hmm. International NGOs, if they want to continue supporting people in Afghanistan, they should go on the ground and continue working on the ground instead of giving money to the Taliban, and they will use those money and those resources to suppress human rights in Afghanistan. And international community should not get involved in that kind of business with the Taliban, where they use the international humanitarian aid for their soldiers and for suppressing the people even further.
Okay, well, let's turn to questions we're getting from our audience, and there are a lot. So first one from Jatin Gandhi, who asks, do you think you can return to Afghanistan safely anytime in the future if the Taliban is still at the helm?
That's my dream, that's my hope, and I will live for that hope. Return one day to my country, and I think I will return to my country one day, because Taliban cannot continue this draconian regime forever. We have the experience with them in 1990s. They will not last forever. Afghanistan has changed. We have a very different generation now who had a chance to educate themselves, who had a chance to experience freedom of expression, who had a chance to experience participating in elections for the first time in our history. So, and we have a very large urban-based population now, and Taliban have nothing in common with urban-based population. They also have nothing in common in our rural-based population, but there is the level of awareness and the level of education in the urban centers are different. So all these things make me hopeful that Taliban will not last long, or at least they have to change their tactics and their policies if they want to continue ruling the country.
Mm-hmm. All right. Another question from Sher Kashimov, who asks, there is currently a disbalance or an imbalance between, this is kind of getting at what you were just talking about, the exposure Kabul is getting and the lack of exposure to what's happening in the rest of Afghanistan. Is there a role for the international media in remedying this imbalance to cover more what is happening? And then I guess my own follow-up to that is, how can we in the West get valid or truthful information about what's happening in Afghanistan if there are if journalists are being silenced there?
Yeah, after my colleague Ilyas Dai was assassinated by the Taliban in Helmand, in the south of the country, just last November, the south became a dark hole for us. Uh, no access to information. Nobody was willing to go there and report from Helmand, especially, and some parts of Kandahar, which is neighboring to Helmand. And I think Taliban used that tactics to, force journalists and reporters to evacuate from those areas. So we really don't know what's happening now in Helmand, because very limited access for reporters, domestic reporters in those areas. And at the same time, we hear a lot of atrocities and violation of human rights by the Taliban reported by people. So, but no professional journalists are on the ground to go and safely report on these and document these things. So, international media, I think, can go to those areas with guarantees from the Taliban and their own governments, and then report. There is a vacuum of information there, and that vacuum can be still filled by international media.
Another related question, this one from Arib Hashmi, who brings up a very important, really a courageous and outstanding photojournalist from Reuters who was recently killed, Danish Siddiqui. And he mentions that he was killed after being captured alive because the Taliban, even before taking control of the country, wanted to gain legitimacy by saying that journalists should inform us if they are coming to Afghanistan. In other words, any journalist who comes from outside risks being killed if they didn't get permission. And to speak to what's going to happen, I think, in the future, what do you think about the possibility of journalists being able to get into Afghanistan from outside?
It really depends on Taliban's decisions. It doesn't depend on our laws, and because the laws do not exist anymore. So it depends on their way of decision making and policies. So I hope that should be part of the leverage and the pressure the international community puts on the Taliban to keep the space available for domestic, or at least for international media and reporters to get to be able to get inside Afghanistan and report from different corners of the country, especially those corners which are really dark now.
Another interesting question from Azita Hatef. And Azita asks, how do you recommend that journalists cover the Taliban? On the one hand, it's important to cover what they say, their motivations and their plans, but by doing so, we also risk legitimizing and amplifying their messages. So how can we balance informing the public without simply elevating the voices of the Taliban?
Well, I think their PR should be examined by what they are doing on the ground. Every day, we should not give free ride as journalists to anyone, especially to the groups who have such kind of track record of a violation of human rights and committing suicide attacks, killing civilians, and have ties with the international terrorist groups. So if you give, as a journalist, a free ride to that kind of group, I think if I do that, I will be part of the crime.
Mm-hmm. Okay. But it is, as Azita points out, you do have to say what the Taliban, if the Taliban says, women must stay inside because otherwise our people will attack them because they haven't been trained not to attack them. Do we just ignore that, or do we still have to cover what?
Which people are not trained to attack women? I mean,
Taliban people, obviously, yeah. Oh, Sammy, are you there? Um, I think we just had a technical problem. Sami may have lost his connection. So let's see if we can try to get him back. If you can hear me now, we're going to try to get Sami back, and we're going to try to get to more questions. While we're waiting for Sami to come back, I will mention a little bit more about the story that we talked about. Sami, are you there, first of all? Okay, still not hearing Sami. The story that I mentioned earlier that IJNet did, which was really outlining what people who are watching this from outside can do to help Afghan journalists, and how Afghan journalists themselves can help. So I want to just mention a little bit about the things that are in there, so that those of you who are listening and may not have seen that story yet can get an idea of how you can help. There is a group of press freedom organizations called the Journalists in Distress Network. It's made up of 18 international organizations that try to help journalists who are being threatened or need help getting out of countries. PJ is here. We're back. Okay,
I'm
great.
back. I'm sorry.
Okay, good. No problem. I know that happens often. Mentioning that if you check out that story, you'll be able to see how the Journalists in Distress Network, among others, are working to help Afghan journalists, and how they are, for example, get on a list to try to get out of the country. Obviously, it's going to be very point, but I did want to mention that while we were waiting for Sami to come back. So Sami, you were talking about who is saying these things, and who should we be giving letting have the voice?
Well, yes, the question that the statement that people are not trained to not attack women. What does it mean?
Yeah,
yeah, generally and naturally, human beings are not attacking each other. Especially, why should they be trained not to attack women? If they are talking about their soldiers, that they have that kind of nature, that attacking women or something is something natural to them, then that exposes a lot and says a lot about the kind of the group they are and the kind of soldiers they have. Yeah. So women have been out there and working in different sectors of society in Afghanistan. In any of my classes in Kabul University, more than 40%, even 50% of the students were girls, and the sharpest ones. The best students were girls, and nobody was attacking them.
Yeah,
from where this mentality comes from, I don't understand. So it is just, a very naive way of making excuses for suppressing women and for not letting them to go outside their houses, study or work, or just be part of the society and part of the country.
Okay. Let's go to another question from Ting Fu. Are we already seeing censorship in Afghanistan with Taliban in control?
Yes. Yes, we already see that media are not broadcasting music anymore.
Okay.
Very less, especially songs by women. You cannot see them anymore, or very limited.
What about news? What about news?
Also about news. Media. I see some very courageous outlets that they still run critical reports on the Taliban and other groups, but you can see that more and more news is about the Taliban, their plans, and what are they doing around the cities. So more of softballs. And I don't, criticize people for running that kind of news now in Kabul, because their lives are under risk. They could just easily lose their lives because of running a critical report about the Taliban.
Yeah, absolutely. We never want to push someone to do tough reporting that gets them killed. Question from Kim Yeri. Can you talk a little bit about the difference you find in the coverage in the Western media and Afghan media about what's happening in Afghanistan right now? What are the things that you think are missing in the coverage of Western media that maybe you do see in the coverage in Afghan media?
Well, a lot of things, but first and foremost, for Western media, the war has ended. The longest and never-ending war of America has ended. So it's they are talking about the civil war in Afghanistan now.
Yeah.
But for us, the war has never ended yet.
Mm-hmm.
It has just started another phase of the war. And there is no difference between the war today and the war which was happening like a few months ago, when the Americans were still there and providing some support, air support for our national security forces. So the war has not ended yet for us. That's one thing. The second thing is, I think international media is looking into the Taliban PR as something like Taliban has changed, but as I said earlier, you don't see much of that in domestic media. Mm-hmm. Maybe sometimes because they are under pressure, but really no, there's no that kind of sense in important domestic media. Those are, I think, those two more important things.
Great. Another good question here from, I believe I'm going to miss this name, but I'm going to try. Itai Brian Muntimbanyoka, who asks a question that I think is very important about one thing that is different now from the 90s, which is social media. Is it helping, and will it continue to help information dissemination, helping people get to safety, receiving assistance from NGOs, and perhaps giving a voice when traditional media are taken over by the Taliban?
I think yes, it's playing a very important, vital role now. We use whenever something happens, on Kabul streets, you see that someone has posted something on social media. Like even if a Taliban soldier beats someone on the streets, which unfortunately happens like every day, then you see on social media. So that puts kind of pressure on the Taliban and their supporters, that you have to behave otherwise you're exposed every day on social media. And that makes people worried that maybe one day they will decide to just put an end to the internet and social media in Afghanistan, and especially that now they are controlling the state, and they have the means to control internet and put more filters. One of the international media reporters once told me, when we were talking and predicting what will happen to media in Afghanistan once Taliban are in Kabul, she told me that you will have something similar to Saudi Arabia's media. So state-run, not critical of the authorities, but still some entertainment, some news, and news should be very much filtered by the authorities, and also social media will be filtered by the government. Or maybe a closer example could be the Islamic Republic of Iran's media, that cannot be very much critical of the authorities. They have some kind of entertainment, but the role of women in the entertainment industry is very, very limited. While we had a very huge role women played in our entertainment media industry, music, the music petitions, and funny, entertaining shows on TVs, and also chit chats by female anchors of radios, which were very popular in Afghanistan. We are going to lose all of them.
We have probably time for a couple more questions. This one is from Chiran Podyal, which is, we're really saddened to hear how the Taliban is controlling Afghanistan now. How is it possible when Afghanistan was a democratic country for nearly 20 years, not a perfect democracy, obviously, but going to school, 60 women MPs were elected. Is there public support for the Taliban? If not, why and how were they able to gain control?
Well, let me start from the ending of this question. They were able to get control of the country, especially the capital, because our leadership was incompetent. The president, unfortunately, and his closest and most powerful advisors who controlled the security apparatus in the country, they were incompetent, unfortunately. And the national security advisor had zero experience in security, but he was the one who would make decisions about security, the army, the police, and intelligence. So that's one of the reasons. The second reason is the abrupt decision by the United States to just conclude its mission in Afghanistan and announce that they will leave the country by September 11, 2021, unconditioned, with no conditions. So that gives the Taliban a free ride in the country. And lack of leadership, lack of support, and losing especially technical support from the international forces in Afghanistan, and the corruption inside the government, these are caused collapse of the state. But we know that our security forces were fighting the Taliban since 2014, almost independently. They were receiving only air support from the American forces. That was it. All fights were fought by our own national security forces. So some people, when they question the courage and patriotism of our national security forces, I don't agree with that. We have lost thousands of soldiers, but the leadership was incompetent. The leadership should be questioned one day by our domestic courts or international courts. But coming to the question of popular support for the Taliban, I don't see popular support for the Taliban because they have not shown much belonging to the country, to our culture, to our way of life. And you see Taliban have a problem in the urban centers. Just days after Kabul was captured by the Taliban, we had our National Flag Day, our Independence Day, the 102nd anniversary, and people across the country were waving the national flag, and Taliban were shooting at them, firing at them.
Right.
And it was happening in the Jalalabad, in the eastern Afghanistan, where is predominantly Pashtun city, in Khost, which is another predominant Pashtun city. But youngsters and the urban population has that kind of problem with the Taliban. To conclude it, I would say I don't see any kind of popular support, and recent research show that the Taliban ideology and their kind of governance has only about 15% support.
That's
out
very
of 35 million people in Afghanistan.
So a last question that follows on that one. You mentioned the people in Jalalabad and elsewhere waving the Afghan flag. Of course, we have armed resistance in the Panjshir Valley. How much hope do you have that any of this sort of resistance, whether it's peaceful resistance like people waving the flag or the armed resistance happening there, do you have much hope that that can lead to a better future?
I think that's just the beginning. You will see more resistance in cities like Kabul, Jalalabad, Kandahar, Herat, and Mazar, and other cities, because the balance between rural population and urban population, as I mentioned earlier, has changed. So more than 35% of the population resides in urban centers. We didn't have this in the past during Taliban regime. That's one thing. The second thing, Taliban have occupied, the country militarily, but that's because the national security forces have collapsed because of the bad leadership that I mentioned earlier. But the population is there, and they have the experience of fighting against the Taliban. I don't support violence, but when it comes to, a group occupying your land, your properties, your home, then people pick arms, anywhere in the world, and they will resist for their rights. The good thing, the fortunate thing here is that these national resistance forces, which are operating now in Panjshir Valley and also in Andarak Valley, another valley in the northeast, they have said that they are fighting for democracy, for freedom of expression, for women's rights, for elected governments. So these are signs of.
Okay. Well, I'm afraid we don't have time for more questions. I think we could keep this discussion going for hours longer. We have a lot of questions we weren't able to get to, but I really thank all of you who are watching this webinar for joining and for sending us your excellent questions. I do encourage everyone to visit ijnet.org, sign up for our newsletters there in 8 languages to get the latest journalism news, tip sheets on everything from investigative reporting to media sustainability, opportunities for career advancement. I encourage you also to follow IJNet and ICFJ on all of your social media. And I just want to close by saying, Sami, thank you so much for joining us and for all that you have done to build high quality independent media in Afghanistan. We all hope that work will be able to continue. And we also, obviously we want to say how much we are thinking about the journalists who are still in Afghanistan trying to get out, or those who may not be able to get out. We must all pledge to do everything that we can to support Afghan journalists at this terrible time. So thank you very much, Sami, and we look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you, Patrick, so much for this opportunity, and I thank the IGNet team and ICFJ. And thank you so much, and I hope one day peace will return to my country and I will be reporting again from Afghanistan.
We hope the same. Thank you, Sami.
Thank you.